Skunk Ape hunts Neches River horseback hunters in Tyler County, Texas. Chapter 1. The expedition begins. East Texas exhaled its early morning breath, a foggy embrace that swaddled the dense woodlands in an ethereal mist. Birds serenaded the dawn, but the deeper parts of the forest remained silent, hiding the mysteries that lay therein. Two figures emerged on horseback from a clearing, the rising sun casting long shadows that danced in tandem with their movements. Jake, with a rough beard and hawkish eyes, rode with an air of confidence. He'd grown up hearing the whispered tales of Tyler County, though he never lent them much credence. To him, the land was a playground for his hunting exploits, a passion passed down from generations of his family. Beside him, a younger man named Theo adjusted the strap of his binoculars. In stark contrast to Jake's rugged appearance, Theo's face bore traces of academia, the studious kind that spent more time behind books than out in the wilderness. But it was precisely this mix of Jake's experience and Theo's meticulous planning that made them a formidable team. "It's good to be back," Jake remarked, taking a deep breath of the fresh woodland air. The scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and the distant sweetness of blooming wildflowers filled his senses. Theo adjusted his cap, shielding his eyes from the sun. "This place feels different," he replied, surveying their surroundings with a hint of unease. "My grandfather used to talk about the forests of Tyler County. Said they held secrets, memories of old." Jake laughed. "Superstitious nonsense. All forests have their tales, Theo. It's up to us whether we want to believe them or not." Finding a suitable clearing near the gentle flow of the Neches River, they decided to set up camp. Jake began gathering firewood, while Theo meticulously arranged their equipment. As the sun rose higher, burning off the remnants of the morning fog, their campsite took shape, a blend of modern equipment and old-fashioned woodsmanship. Around noon, as Jake cooked a simple meal over their newly lit fire, a rustling from the woods caught their attention. Out from the trees walked an elderly man, leaning heavily on a gnarled walking stick. His clothes were worn, suggesting he'd been living in the woods for some time. But it was his eyes, old, wise, and filled with stories, that held the hunter's attention. "Morning, strangers," the old man greeted, nodding his head. "Name's Elias. I live a ways down the river. Smelled your cooking and thought I'd come to say hello." Jake, always the more sociable of the two, invited him to share their meal. As they ate, Elias regaled them with stories of the land. Stories of spirits that walked the woods, of creatures not entirely of this world, and of the strange happenings that locals whispered about but never spoke of openly. "You boys aren't from around here, are ya?" Elias asked, his eyes narrowing with a mix of curiosity and concern. "We're here for the alligators," Theo replied, trying to deflect from the directness of the question. "Heard the Neches River's teeming with them." Elias chuckled, a raspy, deep sound that seemed to echo the very soul of the forest. "Aye, you'll find gators all right. But be wary. There's more than just reptiles in these woods. You see those tracks?" He pointed to a set of footprints close to the water's edge, larger than any humans, with long, distinct claw marks. Jake laughed nervously. "Probably just a bear." Elias locked eyes with him. "No bear made those tracks, son. And they're fresh. Whatever it is, it's close. And it's watching." With that cryptic warning, Elias took his leave, disappearing into the woods as quietly as he had come. Theo, ever the skeptic, brushed off Elias's words. "Locals always have their tales to keep outsiders away. Don't let it get to you." But as night began to fall, and the two hunters settled into their tents. An uneasy feeling crept over the campsite. In the pitch darkness, every rustle of the leaves, every distant hoot of an owl, seemed magnified. And as Jake lay staring up at the canvas above him, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone. In the heart of the Tyler County woods, the expedition had begun. And with it, the thin line between legend and reality started to blur. Chapter 2. The Alligator Hunt. The sun shone high and hot, casting shimmering reflections upon the lazy flow of the Neches River. As its golden rays penetrated the thick canopy, Jake and Theo ventured deeper into the waterways, their eyes peeled for any sign of the elusive alligator they sought. Jake, leading the way in a small flat-bottomed boat, had a harpoon at the ready. His grip was firm, his eyes sharp, every muscle in his body tensed in anticipation. Beside him, Theo operated a sonar device, the beeps and blips providing a secondary set of eyes beneath the murky water. "Hold up," Theo whispered, his hand signaling for Jake to stop the boat. The sonar screen showed a sizable blip, indicating a large object beneath. Jake steadied his harpoon, waiting for the opportune moment. With an explosive splash, a massive alligator burst forth, its scaly hide glistening in the sun. Its eyes, cold and ancient, locked onto the boat. In one fluid motion, Jake thrust his harpoon, piercing the creature's tough hide. A struggle ensued, the water churning violently as the gator tried to escape. But with teamwork and expertise, Jake and Theo managed to subdue the mighty reptile, a testament to their combined prowess. "That's a good 9-footer," Jake exclaimed, wiping sweat from his brow. They secured their catch to the boat, both hunters reveling in the adrenaline of the hunt. The day wore on, and they ventured further into the marshes, hoping for another catch. However, as they delved deeper into the labyrinthine waterways, the forest grew denser, its shadows longer. The chirping of crickets and distant calls of birds were occasionally punctuated by unfamiliar, eerie sounds that seemed to emanate from the very heart of the wilderness. "Did you hear that?" Theo whispered, straining his ears. Jake nodded, his demeanor suddenly more cautious. It was a guttural sound, neither animal nor human, echoing eerily through the thickets. "Probably just some wild animal," he said, though his voice betrayed a hint of doubt. Deciding to set up a temporary camp on a patch of dry land, they secured their boat and began to prepare their evening meal. The dense underbrush rustled occasionally, hinting at the myriad of creatures that called this place home. However, as darkness cloaked the land, the duo felt a growing sense of unease. The nocturnal sounds of the forest seemed more pronounced, more deliberate. Theo, trying to shake off his anxiety, suggested they recount tales of their previous hunting expeditions to lighten the mood. Midway through Jake's tale of his encounter with a mountain lion in Colorado, a sudden, heavy thud interrupted him. They both turned sharply towards the sound. Just beyond their campfire's glow lay a basketball-sized rock. Silence enveloped them. The weight of the situation pressed down on the two hunters. Rocks that size didn't just fall from trees. And there were no cliffs or highlands nearby. Theo, swallowing hard, finally broke the silence. Maybe it was just some playful kids? Jake frowned. Out here? In the middle of nowhere? And that size? It wasn't just tossed, it was hurled. The two men held their weapons tightly, scanning the surrounding darkness. Another guttural sound echoed through the woods, closer this time. The pair's previous bravado had vanished, replaced by a tangible fear. Their hunting expertise might have prepared them for alligators, but this was something entirely different. "Let's pack up and move," Jake whispered, urgency evident in his voice. As they hurriedly packed their equipment, another rock, even larger, crashed close to them, splintering the tree it hit. The message was clear. Whatever was out there, it wanted them gone. Paddling furiously, they navigated their boat away from the spot, guided only by the dim light of the stars. The haunting sounds followed them, occasionally accompanied by the splash of another rock hitting the water. As dawn approached, and the first light began to filter through the trees, the eerie noises began to fade. Exhausted, both mentally and physically, they finally felt safe enough to stop and catch their breath. "What was that?" Theo asked, his voice shaky. Jake, looking equally shaken, replied, "I don't know, but it's clear we're not welcome here." Yet, even as they spoke, they couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched. The woods, once a place of adventure, now felt like a vast, silent witness to a primordial secret, one that was aware of their presence and might not let them leave without a fight. Their successful alligator hunt seemed a distant memory as they grappled with the reality of the danger they now faced. Little did they know that their journey had only just begun, and the true hunt, a game of survival, was about to unfold. Chapter 3. Midnight Mysteries. Jake awoke with a start. The soft, eerie glow of the moon bathed their campsite in a silvery light, casting long, wavering shadows on the tent walls. He could hear the muted sound of Theo's breathing from the other side, steady but uneasy. Something had disturbed him from his sleep. Then he heard it, a low, mournful howl echoing in the distance. Frowning, Jake carefully unzipped the tent flap and peeked outside. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange hue. He stepped out, reaching for his rifle, but stopped cold. The barrel of the gun was grotesquely bent, rendered useless. Stifling a curse, he quickly checked Theo's rifle, finding it similarly disfigured. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. This wasn't the work of any animal. No creature, no matter how strong, could so purposefully and cleanly bend the barrel of a rifle. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. They were dealing with something far more intelligent, far more sinister than they'd anticipated. Theo stirred, groggily coming to terms with the situation. "What the? Jake? What happened?" Jake shook his head, trying to find words. "I don't know, Theo. But this isn't normal." The two of them sat by the dying embers, contemplating their situation. It was Theo who broke the silence. "Do you remember the stories old man Elias mentioned? About the creatures in these woods? Legends, he called them." Jake nodded. "Skunk Ape, they called it. Said it was like a Bigfoot, but with a terrible stench." "But that's just old folk tales, right? Stuff they tell kids to keep them from wandering too far into the woods." Theo looked thoughtful. "Legends often have a basis in reality, Jake. Distorted over time, yes, but rooted in some truth. Maybe, just maybe, we've stumbled upon that truth." The weight of their predicament settled heavily on them. They were deep in the woods, their primary weapons rendered useless, being stalked by an unknown entity with both strength and intelligence. "Okay, let's think this through," Jake started, trying to bring some order to their thoughts. "This thing, whatever it is, has been watching us, studying us. Those rocks, the bent rifles, it's all deliberate. It's trying to scare us, weaken us. Theo's eyes narrowed, or trap us." A silent understanding passed between them. They were seasoned hunters, skilled trackers. If they were to get out of this alive, they had to turn the tables. Instead of being the hunted, they needed to become the hunters. "We need to find this thing, track it, understand it," Theo said with determination. "If we know what we're dealing with, we have a fighting chance." Using the moonlight as their guide, they began to scour the surrounding area, looking for any signs, any tracks that could give them a clue. Hours seemed to blend together as they delved deeper into the mystery. As dawn began to break, they stumbled upon a clearing. In its center stood a large, makeshift altar of sorts, assembled from rocks and adorned with crude drawings. The images depicted humanoid figures, tall and imposing, standing alongside smaller, human-like figures. In the middle was a representation of the skunk ape, its foul odor emanating from it in wavy lines. Theo knelt, inspecting the altar more closely. This looks like a warning. Or maybe a boundary? A mark of territory? Jake took a deep breath. "We've intruded on its land. It's not just hunting us, Theo. It's defending its home." Suddenly, a putrid stench filled the air, so overpowering it made their eyes water. From the dense foliage, a low growl rumbled, growing louder and more menacing. The skunk ape was near, and it was watching. Instead of retreating, Jake and Theo stood their ground, trying to project strength and confidence. They had the knowledge now, a sense of what they were up against. And with that knowledge came power. "We respect your territory," Jake shouted, hoping the creature could understand. "We made a mistake. Let us leave in peace." The growling ceased, but the foul odor lingered. The dense forest remained silent, save for the soft chirping of birds welcoming the dawn. Taking it as a sign, Jake and Theo slowly retreated, never turning their backs to the clearing. As they made their way back to their camp, they knew their ordeal was far from over. But they were no longer prey. They were equals in this deadly game of cat and mouse, with the stakes higher than ever before. Chapter 4. Lost horses. The sun climbed higher in the sky, casting its warm glow over the dense East Texas forest. Birds sang from their perches, and insects hummed in harmony. However, this seemingly serene morning bore no consolation for Jake and Theo. Making their way back to the camp, they had hoped to regroup and strategize their escape from these woods. But as they approached, a sense of unease settled over them. The hobbles they'd used to keep their horses nearby were empty. The once trampled ground bore signs of chaos: hoof prints in wild patterns, broken branches, and discarded saddlebags. Their trusty steeds had been spooked and had taken off in the night. "Damn it," Theo murmured, scanning the surrounding wilderness. "Without the horses, our journey out just got a lot longer and more treacherous." Jake kicked at the dirt, frustration evident. "We need to find them. They're our best chance out of here." He hesitated, adding, "Besides, those horses are family. We can't leave them behind." They began their search, moving in the direction of the most distinct hoof prints. Hours of tracking led them deeper into the woods, away from any familiar landmarks. As they ventured further, the air grew thick with that now all too familiar putrid stench. Their hearts pounded in unison, recognizing the signature scent of the skunk ape. At the source of the smell, they stumbled upon a clearing, so eerily quiet that it seemed the very forest held its breath. The grass here was flattened, hinting at frequent visits. In the center of the clearing stood what could only be described as primitive huts, makeshift shelters crafted from large leaves, branches, and moss. They were oddly proportioned, too large for an average human, but perfect for something bigger. Theo approached one of the shelters with caution, peering inside. "It's empty," he whispered, though he couldn't shake off the sensation of being watched. Jake, meanwhile, inspected the ground. He found distinct footprints, larger than any humans and with features that were unmistakably primate. Around the huts were remnants of food, half-eaten animals, and, disturbingly, remnants of what appeared to be clothing. "Theo," Jake murmured, horror seeping into his voice. "I think it's been hunting more than just animals." Gulping back his fear, Theo nodded. "We're not the first ones here, and unless we're careful, we won't be the last." Suddenly, from the direction of the dense thicket, they heard a sound, the soft, unmistakable whinny of a horse. Their eyes met, hope flaring momentarily. Without a word, they moved stealthily toward the sound. Peeking through the foliage, they caught sight of their horses, tied crudely to trees. They seemed unharmed but were visibly anxious, their eyes wide with fear. Just as they were formulating a plan to retrieve their steeds, a shadow loomed from the opposite side. The skunk ape emerged, its hulking form moving with surprising grace. The creature paused, tilting its head as if listening to the soft whinnies of the horses. Its gaze then shifted, and for a brief moment, its eyes met Jake's. Those eyes, deep and intelligent, bore into him with an intensity that sent shivers down his spine. Frozen in place, Jake could only watch as the creature approached one of the horses, running a large hand gently down its mane. To his surprise, the horse, instead of recoiling, seemed to calm down, lulled by the creature's touch. The skunk ape then turned and disappeared into one of the huts, leaving the horses unattended. Seeing their chance, Jake and Theo moved quickly but quietly, reaching their horses and swiftly untying them. They needed to leave, and fast. But as they mounted, Theo paused, looking back at the huts with a conflicted expression. "We can't just leave," he whispered, not without understanding. "This creature, it's intelligent, Jake. Maybe it doesn't want to harm us. Maybe it's just as scared of us as we are of it." Jake, his patience wearing thin, snapped, "Now's not the time, Theo. We need to go." With a final glance at the makeshift village, the two rode out, pushing their horses to their limits, seeking the safety and familiarity of their camp. However, as they galloped away, an unsettling thought took root in their minds. Were they truly the hunters in this game? Or were they just pawns in a much larger play, orchestrated by the very creature they sought to understand? Chapter 5. Unsettling realizations. The dense canopy overhead allowed only narrow beams of sunlight to pierce through, casting a muted glow over the forest floor. With every step, the underbrush crunched beneath the hooves of Jake and Theo's horses, but the predictable cadence brought them no comfort. Jake's gaze flitted about, his fingers tightening around the reins with each sudden rustle of leaves or snap of twigs. "I can't shake the feeling," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the symphony of the woods. "It's like we're being watched. Every move, every breath." Theo nodded in agreement, his eyes also darting around, trying to discern any movement. "Ever since we left that clearing," he began, his voice trembling, "I've felt eyes on us. Like we're not alone." And then it happened. A sudden, vicious whiz cut through the air, followed by a resounding thud as a basketball-sized rock embedded itself in the ground mere inches from Theo's horse, causing the creature to rear up in terror. Both men were instantly on high alert, their eyes scanning the vicinity for the source. Another rock followed, this one narrowly missing Jake's shoulder and crashing into a nearby tree with a force that suggested nothing less than malevolent intent. "This isn't just random. It's calculated," Jake hissed, realizing the terrifying truth. The hunters had become the hunted. The duo kicked their horses into a gallop, desperate to outpace their unseen assailant. But as they sped through the dense underbrush, the barrage continued. Rocks, branches, and other debris rained down, each projectile more precise and menacing than the last. As the forest blurred around them, a realization crept into Theo's mind, one that he was hesitant to voice but could no longer suppress. Pulling back on his reins, he forced his horse to a stop, prompting Jake to halt as well. The rocks. Jake, think about it. Those throws are too accurate, too forceful for any normal human. And the distance they're covering? It's the skunk ape. It has to be. Jake's face paled, the weight of Theo's words settling in. So, what are you suggesting? That we're its game? That this is some twisted hunt for it? I don't know, Theo admitted, his voice quivering. But we need a plan. We can't just run. We need to understand its behavior, predict its next move. As they pondered their next course of action, another rock came hurtling toward them. This time, however, Jake was prepared. Ducking swiftly, he evaded the missile, then quickly unslung his bow from his back, nocking an arrow and letting it fly in the direction the rock had come from. A deep, guttural roar echoed through the forest, confirming that Jake's arrow had found its mark. Yet, as the two men braced themselves for a confrontation, an eerie silence descended. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, but there was no further sign of the skunk ape. Cautiously, Jake and Theo began to move forward, keenly aware of the ever-present sensation of being observed. The sun began its descent, casting long shadows that played tricks on their eyes. Every tree, every bush seemed to shift and sway, creating an unsettling tapestry of potential hiding spots for the elusive creature. Setting up a makeshift camp as night fell, the two hunters sat back to back, weapons at the ready, jumping at every nocturnal sound. Sleep seemed an impossible luxury. As the hours ticked by, the cold, hard truth became increasingly evident. They were trapped in a deadly game of cat and mouse, with the roles distressingly reversed. The forest, which had once been their playground, was now their prison. And in the midst of this chilling realization, a new, horrifying thought occurred to Jake. What if the skunk ape wasn't acting alone? What if there were more of them, watching, waiting, and orchestrating the hunt? He leaned closer to Theo, his voice a shaky whisper. We need to get out, and soon. Because if we don't, we may never leave these woods alive. Chapter 6. An unseen stalker morning light seeped through the trees, a muted gold that seemed pale and washed out compared to the vibrant hues they were used to. The night had been restless, punctuated by every sound the forest could muster, and as the first rays of dawn appeared, both men felt a weariness that went beyond mere physical exhaustion. Today, we turn the tables, Jake declared, his voice firm despite the dark circles under his eyes. We need to set a trap, get this creature on our terms. Theo nodded, pushing himself to his feet. I agree, but how? Every time we think we have it cornered, it disappears. Jake looked thoughtful. We play to our strengths. We're hunters, Theo. We know how to use the environment to our advantage. We need to think of the skunk ape as just another target. The two brainstormed, using their combined knowledge of the forest and its inhabitants. They decided on a pit trap, using a fresh deer carcass as bait. With the trap set in a clearing, they'd have a clear line of sight, and the skunk ape would have fewer places to hide. It took them the better part of the morning to dig the pit deep and wide enough. They lined it with sharpened stakes, covering the top with a thin layer of leaves and branches. Nearby, they placed the deer carcass, its scent wafting through the air, a clear invitation to any predator. Hiding in the dense underbrush, Jake and Theo waited, their senses heightened, every muscle taut. Hours dragged by, the forest alive with its usual sounds. Birds chirped, critters scurried, but of the skunk ape, there was no sign. As the afternoon sun began its descent, casting long, ominous shadows, Jake began to feel the weight of disappointment. Perhaps the creature was smarter than they'd given it credit for. Just as he was about to suggest they abandon their post, a deep, rumbling growl echoed through the trees. It was low, guttural, and full of malice. Both men held their breath, their eyes locked onto the clearing. A massive, hulking silhouette appeared on the clearing's edge. Covered in thick, matted fur, the creature moved with a predatory grace that belied its size. It approached the deer carcass slowly, cautiously, its nostrils flaring as it took in the scent. But then, as if sensing something amiss, the creature paused. It cocked its head, its gaze sweeping the area. Its eyes, deep set and glowing a faint yellow, seemed to pierce right through the foliage where Jake and Theo were hiding. With a roar that shook the very ground they were on, the skunk ape retreated, disappearing into the trees before the two men could react. "Damn it!" Jake hissed, frustration evident in his voice. It knew. It knew about the trap. Theo, however, was already on the move, darting toward the spot where the creature had been just moments before. Jake followed suit, and what they found sent chills down their spines. On the ground, near the deer carcass, were tufts of thick, matted hair, still warm to the touch. Alongside it, a series of footprints, each one larger than a man's hand, the impressions deep, suggesting incredible weight. The stories were right, Theo murmured, his voice awed. "It's real, Jake. The skunk ape is real." Jake nodded, a grim determination in his eyes. "And it's toying with us. But we can't let it. We need to head back to Woodville, regroup, come up with a new plan." They packed up their camp quickly, their movements hurried, the sense of being watched never leaving them. As they trekked back in the direction of Woodville, the shadows seemed to lengthen, the forest growing darker, more oppressive. And throughout their journey, one thought persisted, gnawing at the edges of their minds. If the skunk ape was this cunning, this intelligent, what chance did they stand against it? But even as doubt threatened to overtake them, another emotion bubbled to the surface, one born of determination and sheer will. They were hunters, after all, and the hunt was far from over. Chapter 7. Descent into desperation. The oppressive weight of the East Texas woods hung heavily upon Jake and Theo. They'd come into this adventure brimming with confidence, armed with experience, and lured by the thrill of the hunt. But as days passed and the line between hunter and hunted blurred, desperation began to taint their resolve. By the end of their third day since the botched trap, their food stores were nearly depleted. The rationing began subtly, a little less in the morning, skipping lunch, and having their dinner. They were trained to handle hunger, but it was the thirst that ate at them. Their canteens ran low, and the creeks they encountered had an ominous stillness. It was on the fourth day that Theo first heard it, a distant roar that resonated through the trees. He halted in his tracks, signaling Jake to do the same. The roar faded as quickly as it came, leaving them in agonizing silence. Jake, always the more pragmatic one, brushed it off. "Could be anything," he whispered, "maybe a bear. Let's keep moving." But as the day wore on, the roars grew louder and more frequent. Each echoed with an intimate understanding of their deepest fears, a call that seemed to mock their feeble attempts to escape. Late afternoon found them stumbling across a grisly sight. Just off their path lay the mutilated carcass of a wild hog. Its entrails were strewn across the forest floor, and its head was twisted at an unnatural angle. But the most unsettling part was its belly, or rather, the gaping hole where its belly used to be. "This isn't just any predator's doing," Theo murmured, his voice trembling. "No animal I know of eats like this." Jake's face paled. The skunk ape. They both knew, deep down, that their fears had a name. The legend of the skunk ape was more than just a tale whispered around campfires. It was real, and it was hunting them. That night, as they set up a makeshift camp, Theo couldn't shake the vision of the half-eaten animal. "Jake, we need a plan. It's getting closer. Each roar is louder than the last. We won't survive another 2 days out here." Jake, eyes scanning the thick canopy above, nodded slowly. "We need a distraction. A way to send it off our trail, even if just for a few hours." With a sense of urgency they hadn't felt since their journey began, they set to work. Using what little they had, they made a dummy from clothes, filling it with wet leaves and any edible remnants from their supplies. They doused it with their own sweat and urine, hoping to confuse the skunk ape's keen sense of smell. Placing the dummy in a clearing, they retreated to a hiding spot, watching and waiting. Hours passed, the moonlight filtering through the trees, painting the forest in shades of silver and blue. The quiet was interrupted only by the distant hoot of an owl or the rustle of wind through the leaves. Suddenly, the familiar roar echoed through the night, louder and more aggressive. The forest came alive with the sound of cracking branches and heavy footsteps. The skunk ape emerged from the shadows, a massive hulking figure silhouetted against the moonlit clearing. It approached the dummy cautiously, sniffing and poking. Realizing the ruse, it let out an enraged howl, tearing the dummy apart with a brutality that left both men paralyzed with fear. When the creature left, the men wasted no time. Using the distraction, they made their way east, towards what they hoped was the outskirts of the forest and a way back to civilization. The weight of their encounter bore down on them. Hope was a fragile thing, but they clung to it desperately. The skunk ape may have won the night, but they were determined to survive the days ahead. As dawn approached, a singular thought echoed in their minds. The hunter had become the hunted. But the game was far from over. Chapter 8. Close encounters. The soft haze of dawn filtered through the trees, casting long, spectral shadows over the dense foliage of the East Texas forest. Jake and Theo, their senses heightened from their terrifying ordeal, moved with quiet precision, their eyes darting in every direction. Every rustle, every whisper of wind had them on edge. The previous night's escape felt like a small victory, but the raw terror remained fresh. Jake's thoughts drifted to the dummy they'd crafted, how it was mercilessly ripped apart by the creature. They'd witnessed firsthand the power of the skunk ape, and they knew they were outmatched. Suddenly, Theo stopped, his finger pressing to his lips, urging Jake to silence. He pointed to a distant thicket where the first rays of the sun were refracted in an eerie dance of shadow and light. Through the leaves, a pair of dark, intense eyes stared back at them. Jake's heart pounded in his ears. Every instinct screamed to flee, but his feet felt rooted to the spot. The creature's gaze was unwavering, intelligent. Its massive frame lurked just behind the screen of leaves, nearly blending into the shadows but betrayed by the distinct, foul odor that now permeated the air. As if on cue, The skunk ape took a lumbering step forward. It stood there for a moment, towering, menacing, its chest rising and falling. It was much closer than they'd ever imagined. Jake could see its matted fur, the streaks of mud and clumps of dried blood. It emitted a low, rumbling growl, a warning. Theo, his survival instincts kicking in, grabbed Jake's arm, and they bolted, crashing through underbrush and leaping over fallen logs, their breaths ragged with fear. As they sprinted, the forest opened up to reveal a sharp cliffside. A narrow entrance to a cave beckoned them. Without thinking, they darted in, the darkness swallowing them whole. They pressed further into the cave, the air growing colder, the sound of their own breathing echoing off the walls. Behind them, the creature's roars grew fainter, muffled by the layers of stone. Exhausted, they collapsed to the ground, allowing themselves a moment's respite. Jake pulled out a small flashlight from his pack, its beam cutting through the inky blackness. What it illuminated made both men gasp in surprise. The walls of the cave were adorned with ancient drawings. There were figures of men, armed with spears, surrounding a familiar, beastly figure. The drawing of the creature was unmistakable, the skunk ape. Theo traced the images with his fingers. This can't be. These drawings, they're centuries old. Jake nodded, his throat dry. It's been here, Theo. It's been here for generations. We're not the first to encounter it. As they ventured deeper into the cave, more drawings emerged. Some showed the creature in a peaceful stance, coexisting with the ancient tribes. Others showed violent confrontations, hunters becoming the hunted. For hours, they wandered the labyrinthine depths, the ancient stories painted on the walls guiding them, hinting at a deep, symbiotic relationship between man and creature. This was a sacred space, a record of history, of battles fought and respect earned. But the feeling of awe was soon replaced by a chilling realization. If this was the skunk ape's domain, they were trapped in its den. As night approached, they decided to camp within the cave. The entrance provided a small vantage point, allowing them to keep an eye on the outside world. Every rustle, every shadow played tricks on their weary minds. The night wore on, and as the hours ticked by, an uneasy silence settled in the cave. Jake kept vigil while Theo, exhausted, drifted into a restless sleep. Suddenly, a silhouette appeared at the cave entrance. The familiar stench wafted in. The skunk ape was close, but it didn't enter. Instead, it sat at the entrance, its form bathed in moonlight, as if guarding the sacred space, watching over its history, its legacy. The night passed, and by morning, the creature was gone. The two men emerged from the cave, the weight of their discovery pressing heavily on their shoulders. They realized they weren't just running from a creature, they were running from history itself. With renewed purpose, they decided to make their way back to civilization. Their tale was not just one of survival, but of understanding, of bridging the chasm between man and myth. And as they left the cave behind, they knew that the forest, with all its secrets and legends, would forever be a part of them. Chapter 9. Old Man Jenkins. The weight of the sun was starting to press down upon the East Texas woods. The morning's discoveries left Jake and Theo more contemplative than scared, the ancient drawings offering some solace that this creature, though aggressive, had its reasons, its own stories to tell. Their trudge through the dense foliage took a sudden halt when Theo tripped over a concealed wire. Instantly, a net sprung up from the ground, ensnaring him. Jake rushed forward, attempting to free his friend when a gruff voice echoed through the trees. "Who are you?" "And what are you doing on my land?" From behind a thicket, a tall figure emerged, his hair wild and gray, his beard reaching down to his chest. His skin was weathered, eyes sharp, holding both wisdom and wariness. "Easy there," Jake replied, hands held up, trying to appear non-threatening. "We're lost, just trying to find our way back to civilization." The old man, knife in hand, approached, scrutinizing the two. After what felt like hours, he finally cut Theo free. "Name's Jenkins," he rasped, sheathing his knife. "And you're lucky I found you and not that beast." Jake and Theo exchanged a glance, their encounters with the skunk ape fresh in their minds. "You know about the creature?" Theo asked, rubbing his sore legs. Jenkins chuckled, a low, gravelly sound. "Oh, I've had my run-ins with that monster. Come, you can rest at my place." They followed Jenkins through the woods, finally reaching a quaint cabin, concealed almost entirely by the forest. Smoke wafted from a chimney, and a dog, old and equally weathered, greeted them with a wary growl. Inside, the cabin was warm and comforting, filled with artifacts and books. A pot of stew bubbled on the stove, filling the air with a tantalizing aroma. As they settled down, Jenkins began his tale. "I've lived in these woods for decades. That creature, the skunk ape, has been here just as long, maybe longer. We've reached a sort of understanding, it and I." Jake, intrigued, leaned in. "Understanding?" Jenkins nodded, taking a sip from his mug. "Many years ago, I, too, was a hunter, much like yourselves. One day, I found myself face to face with the creature. Instead of attacking, it just looked at me, deep into my eyes. It saw my soul, and I saw its. That was the day I hung up my gun, decided to coexist." The evening wore on, and as the flickering candlelight cast dancing shadows, the cabin became a sanctuary of shared tales. Jenkins spoke of his many encounters, how the skunk ape had saved him from a bear, how it brought him food when he was ill. Each story painted a picture of a creature more misunderstood than malevolent. But for Jake and Theo, the terrifying memories remained. They listened intently, hoping to find some pattern, some way to safely navigate out of the woods without another confrontation. As the night deepened, Jenkins, seeing their distress, offered a solution. "There's an old trail, barely used, leads right out to the northern edge of the forest. I've walked it many times, and never once ran into the creature there." Hope ignited in the men's eyes. "Will you show us the way?" Theo asked. Jenkins nodded. "Come dawn, I'll lead you to the trailhead. But be warned, the woods are unpredictable. Always be on your guard." The night passed peacefully, the horrors of the past days momentarily forgotten in the warmth of the cabin. But as dawn's first light streamed through the cracks, a new day of challenges awaited. Jake and Theo, with gratitude in their hearts and hope on the horizon, prepared to embark on the next leg of their harrowing journey. The mysteries of the forest, and the skunk ape's place within it, remained etched in their minds, a testament to the enigmatic dance of man and myth. Chapter 10. The river escaped. The morning light seeped through the dense canopy, casting a shimmering glow over the gentle Neches River. The idea had been Jake's, a desperate strategy born out of their harrowing week in the forest. "We build a raft," he had proposed as they sat in Jenkins' cabin. "It might be our best shot at covering ground without being easily tracked." Using Jenkins' tools and some discarded materials from around the cabin, the three men set about constructing a makeshift vessel. The sound of hammering filled the air, and soon, a relatively sturdy raft began to take shape. Jenkins, although initially skeptical, was soon won over by the idea. "I've lived on this river for years, but never thought to use it as a means of escape," he mused, tying the last of the logs together. With the raft completed, they loaded it with their remaining supplies. The weight of their journey, the constant pursuit by the skunk ape, hung heavy in the air, but the river offered a glimmer of hope. "Stay alert," Jenkins warned as they pushed off from the bank. "The river has its own dangers, and the skunk ape might not be our only problem." The gentle current of the Neches carried them forward. The dense trees on either side provided some cover, and for a few hours, it felt like a leisurely float trip. They even managed to catch some fish, cooking it over a makeshift fire on the raft. But as the sun began its descent, the peaceful veneer of the river started to crack. Jake, at the raft's helm, noticed at first an unusual movement in the trees. A rustling, deliberate and ominous. Before he could voice his concerns, a giant rock hurtled from the woods, crashing into the water just inches from their raft. The trio stared in shock at the splash, knowing all too well who, or what, had thrown it. Another rock, this one larger, narrowly missed them, creating a huge splash that rocked the raft. Jenkins, using an improvised oar, tried to increase their speed, his eyes darting towards the shore. "It's toying with us," he murmured. Theo, clutching his bent rifle, tried to scan the tree line, hoping to catch a glimpse of their pursuer. But the skunk ape was crafty, moving through the underbrush with astonishing agility, always just out of sight. Suddenly, with a thunderous crash, the creature emerged from the woods, its massive form now fully illuminated by the dying sunlight. The skunk ape stood on the river's edge, staring them down, its deep growls echoing in the stillness. Without warning, it lunged into the water, powerful arms propelling it towards the raft. Panic set in. Jake and Theo, armed with the raft's oars, tried to fend off the creature, while Jenkins desperately attempted to steer the raft towards the opposite bank. The raft rocked violently under the skunk ape's assault. Water poured in, dousing their supplies and threatening to capsize their only means of escape. In a desperate move, Jake picked up a burning log from their makeshift fire pit and hurled it at the creature. It hit the skunk ape squarely in the face, causing it to release its grip and recoil, howling in pain and rage. Seizing the opportunity, Jenkins guided the raft towards a swift current, increasing the distance between them and the wounded skunk ape. They watched as the creature, now on the shore, roared in frustration, its silhouette growing smaller in the distance. But their relief was short-lived. The damage to the raft from the skunk ape's assault became apparent. Water seeped through its base, and despite their best efforts to bail it out, the raft began to disintegrate. "We have to abandon ship," Theo shouted over the sound of splintering wood. One by one, they jumped into the river, leaving behind their once promising escape plan. As they swam towards the shore, the chilling roar of the skunk ape served as a haunting reminder that the forest and its ancient resident would not let them go easily. Cold, wet, and disheartened, they clambered onto the bank, the weight of their ordeal pressing down on them. Their river escape had ended in disaster, and now, without the cover of the raft, they felt even more exposed. "We need to keep moving," Jake whispered, his voice strained. While it's still distracted by the raft. Gathering their remaining strength, the trio set off into the thick woods, guided only by the dim moonlight. The river, once a symbol of hope, had betrayed them. And now, with the ever-looming threat of the skunk ape, they had to find another way out. The nightmare in East Texas was far from over. Chapter 11. The ruined cabin. The forest was relentless in its embrace, each step they took being challenged by gnarled roots and thorny underbrush. The sounds of night creatures provided an eerie backdrop, but among them all, one sound remained conspicuous in its absence: the roaring of the skunk ape. "I don't like this," Jenkins muttered, his gaze constantly darting between trees. "It's too quiet." Hours seemed to merge as the trio trudged on, fatigue and anxiety making every movement a struggle. The night air was thick with moisture, each breath seeming to carry the weight of the swamp. It was Theo who spotted it first, a darkened structure barely visible through the dense foliage. "Over there," he whispered, pointing. The structure, when they reached it, was a dilapidated cabin, seemingly abandoned for years. Moss and fungi claimed much of its exterior, but its frame was largely intact. Cautiously, they approached, each step on the creaky porch sounding like a gunshot in the silent night. Inside, the remnants of human habitation were everywhere. An overturned chair, a rotting table, broken dishes, and a rusty old lantern. Dust hung heavy in the air, and cobwebs stretched across every corner. Jake gingerly picked up a moldy journal from the floor. The pages, though decayed with age, contained frantic writings. Dates were scribbled above each entry, and as Jake read aloud, a chilling story began to unfold. April 5th, arrived at the cabin today. All is well, but the locals spoke of a creature in the woods. I'll set traps just in case. April 9th, heard strange noises last night. Like the wailing of a lost soul. Perhaps it's just the wind. April 16th, found footprints outside. Not human. Too big for any animal. The stories might be true. April 20th, it's watching me. I can feel it. Every rustle, every shadow. It's waiting. The last entry was dated April 22nd, with only a few words. It's here. Silence filled the cabin as the gravity of their discovery weighed on them. This wasn't their first hint that others had been pursued by the creature, but the journal provided a tangible link to a previous victim. Theo carefully placed the journal back on the table. "We aren't the first, and unless we get out of here, we won't be the last." As if on cue, a distant roar shattered the quiet, sending shivers down their spines. It was a sound they had come to dread, the announcement of the skunk ape's presence. "We need to fortify this place," Jake said, panic evident in his voice. "At least for the night." With haste born of sheer terror, the trio began to barricade the cabin. Windows were boarded up, doors were reinforced, and every possible entry point was blocked. Hours passed, each minute stretching endlessly, punctuated only by the distant, haunting roars of the creature. Inside, the three men huddled together, the only light coming from the dim glow of the rusty lantern. Suddenly, with a force that threatened to break the cabin's very foundation, a loud bang echoed. The creature was outside, and it was trying to get in. Loud scratches accompanied the growls and thuds, each one closer and more aggressive. The old cabin creaked and moaned under the assault, its timbers groaning in protest. "We won't last long at this rate," Theo hissed. Think. Jenkins snapped, "We need a way out." But every possible exit was a death trap, with the creature lurking just outside. As the minutes dragged on, the attacks grew more ferocious, the skunk ape's frustration palpable. It was Jake who spotted it, a trapdoor, half hidden beneath a rotten rug. "Down here," he whispered, pulling it open. Below was a narrow passage, leading into the darkness. Without hesitation, they descended, carefully pulling the door shut above them. The tunnel was dark, damp, and narrow, but it provided a temporary sanctuary from the onslaught above. The distant thuds and roars echoed, but the creature seemed unaware of their new hiding place. Following the tunnel for what felt like hours, they eventually emerged into the night, well away from the cabin and, hopefully, from the skunk ape. Exhausted, battered, but alive, they paused to catch their breaths. The ruined cabin, though a temporary refuge, had also provided a grim reminder. They were not the first to be hunted, and unless they escaped, they might not be the last. With renewed determination, the trio pressed on, the vast Texas wilderness stretching ahead, filled with both hope and horror. The nightmare was far from over. Chapter 12. Last stand. The first streaks of dawn began to pierce the night, casting a gray hue over the trees and allowing the trio to truly comprehend the perilous environment they had once again found themselves in. Their path had looped them back to the cabin, a grim monument to their harrowing ordeal. The absence of the creature's roars didn't bring relief. Instead, it instilled an insidious dread. They knew the beast lurked somewhere, watching, waiting. "We can't keep running," Theo panted, sweat beading his forehead. "We won't make it." Jenkins, the eldest and wisest, surveyed the dilapidated structure. "Then we make our stand here." Without hesitation, they set to work. Using old tools they found scattered around, they began reinforcing the walls, boarding up the windows, and strengthening the doors. They fashioned rudimentary weapons, stakes sharpened to a fine point, Molotov cocktails from old liquor bottles, and tripwires laced with tin cans to act as alarms. As nightfall approached, they positioned themselves. Jake was by the main entrance, an axe in hand and a determination in his eyes that belied his fear. Theo took the rear, a hefty stake and Molotovs at the ready. Jenkins was on the second floor, keeping a vigilant eye through a small slit in the boarded-up window. Darkness swept over the forest, muffling it in a cloak of silence. Then, from the depth of the night, a familiar, blood-curdling roar echoed. The skunk ape was announcing its approach. The first warning came from the tripwires. The clattering of tin cans resonated like a ghastly wind chime. The creature was close. With bated breath, the trio listened. Every crack, every rustle amplified their terror. The thuds grew louder, more aggressive. The beast was hurling itself against the barricaded door. Jake braced himself, his grip on the axe tightening. The door trembled with every impact. But then, as suddenly as it began, the onslaught stopped. An eerie silence filled the cabin. Without warning, a ferocious force hit the rear. Theo barely managed to dodge as wooden planks splintered. A massive, hairy arm reached in, swiping blindly. Acting on adrenaline, Theo hurled a Molotov. Flames burst, illuminating the monstrous face of the skunk ape. It reeled back, howling in rage and pain. "Now!" Jenkins screamed from above, hurling another Molotov, setting the ground around the creature alight. The skunk ape, trapped and disoriented, thrashed violently, attempting to free itself from the blaze. The trio seized their chance. With all their might, they pushed against the weakened walls, toppling them onto the beast. As the dust settled, the skunk ape lay pinned, its roars now feeble whimpers. Jake approached cautiously, axe raised. But as he looked into its eyes, something shifted. There wasn't just malice in those depths. There was fear, confusion, perhaps even a plea for mercy. He hesitated. The once feared beast was now a creature in distress, its might reduced to vulnerability. The same forest that birthed legends of its terror was now its prison and potential tomb. Jenkins and Theo joined Jake, seeing the same realization dawn on him. "What do we do?" Theo whispered. Jenkins, ever the pragmatic, responded, "It's us or it. We've seen what it's capable of." But Jake shook his head. "We leave it. Let nature decide its fate." And so, as the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, the three men walked away, leaving behind the legend of the forest, defeated but alive. Their ordeal with the skunk ape would become a tale of its own, whispered among the locals, retold with varying degrees of belief and skepticism. But for Jake, Theo, and Jenkins, it was a reminder of the thin line between man and myth, hunter and hunted, and the primal fears that bind every creature in the unforgiving dance of survival. Chapter 13. The final chase. The morning air, usually refreshing and serene, was thick with trepidation. Jake, Theo, and Jenkins, fatigued and shaken from the previous night's confrontation, knew their journey was far from over. The path to Woodville lay ahead, a beacon of safety, yet it felt miles away. But it wasn't distance that troubled them, it was what lay between them and that sanctuary. Their instincts were correct. As the trio picked their way through the dense underbrush, a guttural growl reverberated, growing progressively louder. They exchanged wide-eyed looks of realization. The skunk ape wasn't trapped for long. It was coming. The forest around them seemed to pulse with life, every shadow and rustle a potential threat. When the first roar split the air, confirming their fears, it was Jenkins who shouted, "Run!" The chase was on. The once familiar woods transformed into a labyrinth of obstacles. Fallen trees, slippery rocks, and clawing branches all seemed to conspire against them. The creature's footfalls echoed like a relentless drumbeat, growing ever closer. Jenkins, with his deep knowledge of the forest, led them through lesser-known trails, hoping to shake off their pursuer. They sprinted past a moss-covered boulder, leapt over a gurgling brook, and darted through a copse of gnarled trees. But the skunk ape was undeterred. Jake, his lungs burning, shouted above the din, "We need to split up. Divide its attention." Theo nodded in agreement, and without another word, they diverged paths, leaving Jenkins to choose his own way. As Jake weaved through the trees, the weight of isolation bore down on him. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf heightened his paranoia. He barely registered the brook he was crossing until he slipped on a mossy stone, plunging into the cold water below. Gasping and sputtering, Jake scrambled out, his clothes clinging heavily to him. He paused for a mere second to catch his breath, and that's when he saw it, the skunk ape, its massive form shadowed by the trees, inching closer. Panicking, Jake sprinted once more, the icy grip of fear propelling him forward. Trees blurred into a mosaic of green and brown, his vision tunneled, with only the path to Woodville in sight. Theo, on the other hand, had made it to a clearing. The open space should have offered a moment's respite, but the heavy thudding behind him suggested otherwise. He could see the outskirts of Woodville in the distance, the town so tantalizingly close yet so far. His legs, heavy and aching, willed him onward. Suddenly, a searing pain shot through his calf. Theo stumbled and fell, his hand coming away stained with blood when he touched the source of the pain. A glinting, arrow-like object was embedded in his leg. He pulled it out with a grunt, the realization dawning that the skunk ape had found new ways to hunt. The creature had thrown it. Theo, determined not to be an easy prey, picked himself up and limped toward a cluster of rocks. Hiding behind them, He hoped the skunk ape would lose his trail. Meanwhile, Jenkins had taken the riskiest route, leading the creature toward a cliffside. His plan was to trick it into a misstep. But as he neared the edge, the creature's roar resonating beside him, he realized he might have overestimated his odds. Cornered and out of options, Jenkins faced the skunk ape, the abyss behind him and the beast before him. His weathered eyes met the creature's, searching for any hint of recognition or mercy. It was then, in the midst of this deadly standoff, that the forest was pierced by a sound even more chilling, the clear, unmistakable echo of a gunshot. The skunk ape, startled, hesitated, its eyes darting around. Taking his chance, Jenkins sidestepped, letting the creature's momentum carry it dangerously close to the cliff's edge. Before another move could be made, a series of gunshots rang out, sending the creature fleeing into the forest's depths. Jenkins, panting heavily, turned to see a group of Woodville's residents, guns in hand, led by none other than Mayor Carlson. "Figured you folks might need some help," he said with a wry grin. As the adrenaline began to wane, the weight of their ordeal set in. But among the exhaustion and relief, a single thought prevailed: they had survived. The legend of the skunk ape would continue to haunt the woods of Woodville, but for Jake, Theo, and Jenkins, it was a chapter they could finally close. Or so they thought. For in the heart of the forest, obscured by the shadows and the whispers of the trees, the skunk ape watched and waited. The hunt was far from over. Chapter 14. Return to civilization. The sunrise that morning held a hue that Jake, Theo, and Jenkins had longed for, the golden touch of safety. As the trio emerged from the dense tree line, the town of Woodville came into view. Familiar structures, the quaint houses, the old bakery, the rusting water tower, all stood as silent witnesses to their return. Dragging their feet on the town's dusty roads, the men's entrance didn't go unnoticed. Heads peeked out from windows, children halted their morning play, and conversations paused. It was as if time itself had taken a breath. A murmur went through the town. Had the hunters returned as heroes or mere survivors? The narrative of their confrontation with the legendary skunk ape had already started to shape, with Mayor Carlson's account leading the way. Mrs. Martinez, the bakery owner, was the first to approach. Her plump face, usually bright with a smile, was etched with concern. "You boys look like you've seen a ghost," she remarked, handing them each a warm pastry. Theo, still reeling from the trauma, gave a weak smile. "Not a ghost, Mrs. Martinez, something far realer." As they made their way to the town center, they were met with a mix of emotions. Some faces mirrored disbelief, some curiosity, but others, especially the old-timers, showed a knowing understanding, as if their return had confirmed a truth they had long suspected. At the center of the square, Mayor Carlson had convened a gathering. As the townsfolk assembled, the three took their place on the town hall steps. All eyes were on them. Jake cleared his throat, recounting their harrowing experience. As he narrated their near escapes, the chase, and the final standoff, the crowd's reactions fluctuated between horror, skepticism, and awe. However, it was the gunshot's revelation that held the most anticipation. Who had fired that life-saving shot? As the narrative reached that fateful moment, a figure stepped out from the crowd. It was Ray Donnelly, a seasoned hunter with gray streaking his hair and scars adorning his rugged face. "It was me," he announced, his voice carrying weight and gravitas. A ripple of surprise went through the crowd. Ray, after all, was a known skeptic of the skunk ape legend. Seeing the astonishment, Ray elaborated, A few years back, I too had a brush with this creature. I never spoke of it, fearing ridicule. But when I heard what was happening, I knew I had to intervene." He paused, his eyes distant. "That creature. It's smart, cunning. I barely escaped with my life. And I've been preparing for its return ever since." Jake, overwhelmed with gratitude, stepped forward. "Ray, you saved our lives. How can we ever repay you?" Ray simply nodded, by ensuring the truth is known and preparing for its next move. This isn't over. The gathering slowly disbanded, each individual processing the tale in their own way. Some dismissed it as an elaborate story, a product of wild imaginations. Others, recalling their strange experiences in the woods, felt vindicated. But a majority now viewed the forest with a newfound wariness. The sun was setting, casting an orange-pink hue across Woodville. As Jake, Theo, Jenkins, and now Ray, sat on the porch of the local tavern, their shadows mingling with the encroaching darkness, one thing was clear: Woodville was forever changed. The boundary between legend and reality had blurred. And as the night deepened, the forest loomed large on the horizon, silently guarding its mysteries, waiting for the next chapter of the Skunk Ape legend to unfold. Chapter 15. The legend lives on. A month had passed since their harrowing escape from the heart of the forest. Jake sat at his wooden desk, the dim lamplight casting long shadows across the room. Spread before him were pages of scribbled notes, sketches of the creature, and maps marking their journey. The decision to document their story had been unanimous. The town needed to know, to prepare, and to believe. Every evening, Jake, Theo, Jenkins, and Ray would gather at Jake's home, piecing together their memories, sometimes heatedly debating the specifics, but always united by a common purpose. The nights were filled with shared stories, sometimes laughter at near comedic recollections, but more often than not, silence filled the room as they remembered moments of pure terror. One evening, as Theo was sharing a particularly poignant memory of the creature's eyes, intelligent yet predatory, he mused, there was a soft knock at the door. The room fell silent. They hadn't expected any visitors. Jenkins, closest to the door, rose cautiously. As the door creaked open, Mrs. Martinez stood there, a basket in hand. "Evening, boys. Thought you might want some pastries." "Keep your strength up," she said, her eyes darting nervously. The hunters exchanged glances, sensing an underlying urgency in her tone. "Is everything okay, Mrs. Martinez?" Jake asked, concern evident in his voice. She hesitated, then sighed deeply. "Last night, I thought I saw something in my backyard. Large, hulking. But it was gone in a flash. Might have been my imagination. But with everything that's been happening. ... She trailed off, biting her lip. They exchanged worried glances. Was it returning? Or was it merely the town's heightened sense of paranoia? They thanked her and assured her they would check the surroundings. The night deepened, and the wind carried with it a low, haunting hum. The men felt an unsettling presence, as if they were being watched. Their documenting took on a fervent pace. It felt imperative to finish it. Morning came, and with it, an eerie stillness. Theo was the first to step out, stretching and preparing for a new day. But his relaxed demeanor changed instantly when he saw it. Footprints. Large, unmistakably similar to the creatures, circled around Jake's house. They trailed off into the woods, but their message was clear. The skunk ape was near. The men gathered, examining the footprints, their faces pale but determined. I think it's trying to intimidate us, Ray mused, his eyes scanning the tree line. Jenkins nodded in agreement. It's smart, all right. Wants us to know it's still here. The realization that they were not the hunters but the hunted hung heavily in the air. Their documentation took on a new urgency. Weeks passed, and the footprints became a regular occurrence, always appearing overnight, always circling their homes, but never entering. It was as if the skunk ape was toying with them, reminding them of its presence. One evening, as Jake penned the final chapter, he paused, his pen hovering above the paper. The room was silent save for the soft tick-tock of the grandfather clock. "Guys," he began, his voice low and serious, "what if this documentation, our story, what if it's what it wants? To spread its legend, its terror? Theo considered this, you might be onto something. It's been around for centuries, as the cave paintings showed. Maybe it feeds off the fear, the stories." Ray, always the pragmatic one, countered, "Or it might just want to ensure its territory is respected. To let us know that this is its land." Jenkins shivered. "Either way, it's a game of cat and mouse. And we're the mice." They decided to wrap up the documentation with a note of caution to future generations. A guide, a warning, a testament to their ordeal. The last page held a single, haunting image, a sketch of the skunk ape, its eyes peering directly at the reader, its stance both predatory and intelligent. Beneath it, Jake's neat handwriting read, "The legend lives on." And with that, they concluded their tale, sealing it with a mixture of pride and dread. But every so often, when the wind carried that haunting hum, when shadows seemed to lengthen just a bit more, and when the footprints appeared once again, the townsfolk of Woodville would be reminded. The forest held its secrets close, and the skunk ape was one legend that lived on. We hope you have enjoyed our storytelling offering tonight. Please be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications to be alerted of future weekly additions to our collections. Paranormal Untold Stories.